Hi, I'm Dale Sherbeck, and welcome to the HQ, a CHA Learning and HealthCareCAN podcast serial where we dive into healthcare issues and topics from the perspective of its people and discuss them with those that are leading in the health system. Together, we'll try to unpack those topics and learn what actions are being taken to innovatively solve them today. And today, I'm going to dispense with my usual introduction and get to our guest, Shirlee Sharkey, the very recently retired president and CEO of SE Health, or St. Liz, as it has long been affectionately known. To say that Shirlee was a long-serving CEO would be an understatement. She was hired into the role in 1992, which, to put that in perspective, is coincidentally the same year I started my own career. So yes, Shirlee held the position of CEO longer than many of our listeners have been working. And in an era where few CEOs hold more than a 5-year single term in an organization, I felt this was something worth a conversation. I first met Shirlee in 2013 at our National Health Leadership Conference, which was themed From Rhetoric to Action, Achieving Person and Family-Centered Health Systems. Still, new in my own role, Shirlee and the other visionary speakers of that conference easily convinced me that CHA Learning needed to take action, rise to the challenge, and develop training to help foster the transformation that was being called for. And we did that. And to bring it my own small circle, at our conference last month, HealthCareCAN presented her with our prestigious Legacy of Leadership Award in recognition of her outstanding contributions to advancing Canada's health system and her significant and sustained commitment toward the enhancement of the health of Canadians. Indeed, Shirlee Sharkey has long been recognized as one of Canada's foremost experts on home care and healthy aging. As a registered nurse and the longtime CEO of SE Health, a unique not-for-profit social enterprise, she has dedicated her career to empowering people, championing compassion, and advancing social innovation to forever impact how people live and age at home. As evidenced by her generously accepting the invitation to speak with me here today, Shirlee is only too willing to share her passion and expertise as a thought leader, a speaker, an author, and a mentor. In 2020, she collaborated with a range of experts to co-author The Future of Aging, a book that has been described as a brilliant and powerful challenge to locked-in ageist mindsets, policies, and service models. Naturally curious and committed to lifelong learning, Shirlee regularly engages with students, entrepreneurs, business leaders from other industries. And Shirlee's commitment to public service is as evident in her leadership and involvement on many boards. She is also a senior fellow of Canada's top think tank, the C.D. Howe Institute, and internationally, Shirlee is a Healthcare Denmark ambassador and is committed to global influence as she shares her health system insights and experiences around the world. Hi, Shirlee, and welcome to the HQ.
Hi there. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have this chance to spend some focused time with you today, Shirlee, and talking about your career, what you've seen and learned, and to learn from you as others continue to pick up from your own legacy. So I'm wondering if we can first start with your own leadership. And by any definition, 30 years is a long time with a single organization in the same role. I'm not sure what the right question is here exactly, because I assume you didn't plan that exactly to happen. But how does it happen? And more curiously, perhaps, why doesn't it happen more often?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'd start with, how did it happen? A little bit of luck. There's always luck with how these things play out. Being very fortunate to find the right organization in the right area of healthcare that I'm so committed to. It takes sometimes one's entire career. They actually don't find the setting that helps them feel totally fulfilled and inspired in what they're doing. So I think that was a very good starting point for me. The community, independence and freedom for people, which is all sort of the context of what SE Health has always been about. But then I think I stayed 30 years because the organization changed very significantly over those 30 years in growth, in the kinds of services that we provided, but probably even more so over the last 10 years, where I really gave a lot of thought to what a social enterprise is all about, in particular in the context of SE Health as a private nonprofit organization, and how we could continue to provide value to society, which is a much broader way of looking at it than as a home care provider and the services we provide. So I was very fortunate to have the right place, the right environment, and the incredible success of an organization that kept me inspired, and hopefully I helped inspire the staff in the organization.
So sort of a merging of your mission and life with that of the organizations.
Yeah, and I think that in many ways is one of the key factors for leaders to think about when they're looking at other opportunities and positions, if it really aligns with their goals, their values, because especially in a leadership role or as a CEO, I always say, know your values because they will be tested.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll either be successful with that test or get into trouble. So I'm really pleased in 30 years. I hope I didn't get into a whole lot of trouble, maybe just a little bit.
Well, we'll come back to that, I think, later. But so, I mean, do you think that's why some CEOs or many CEOs perhaps don't make it longer than, say, 5 or 10 years in an organization, is because they don't find that same level of connection or to their values or in the mission? Or
I think that's one component. I think another could be some are looking for a change and for the organization to provide the challenges for that change. And in some structures, that growth and diversification may not necessarily occur or be appropriate.
mm-hmm.
But again, I think if leaders are entrepreneurial and the organization they are involved in doesn't move forward, then they're going to look for other opportunities and shift. I think in general, CEOs in the public sector sometimes move around. It's hard to continue to do great things again and again unless the organization or the environment is responding and changing differently. So, I've always said, probably it would have been a lot easier to just move on to some place, be there 5 years, move on to the next place, be there 5 years, move on to the next, because you can keep repeating, the process and cycle. You stick around for a while and then people kind of have a good memory, come up with something different. So I loved it though, because it constantly forced me to have an adventure, to be thinking about things differently, to never think I knew more than I thought I did. And all of those components I think are really helpful for leadership and to be successful in it.
So, I mean, during that time, did you ever think about, cycling on to that next adventure, or thinking that your time had come to an end?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Certainly, I think I was very intentional about every 5 years, and a mentor had told me that, every 5 years, sort of pause and say, are you providing value to the organization? Do you think someone else could do it better? How do you feel about your development and achievement of what you're trying to do in your role? And I will say, every time I thought about really reflecting on that, there wasn't any other place I wanted to move into, especially in the healthcare space.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it sounds kind of hokey, but I thought, hey, this is as good as it gets. I absolutely love what we're doing here. I love the potential for the future. So why would I move on? But I certainly, about every 5 years, did really reflected on those kinds of questions, both from an organizational point of view and the value, and for myself personally. But I guess 30 years I did stay around within that. But I will tell you, I did give a lot of thought to when I wanted to step down. And it's interesting where, I've been, and it's probably a component of ageism where I've said, no, don't use that word retiring. It's about sort of switching lanes or something different,
mm-hmm.
no matter what one is doing. They may be leaving their job or career and do want to move into so many other things. So when we use the word retiring, it's correct, retiring from the organization, yes, but not from life.
Yeah.
And other opportunities within that. And I did give a lot of thought to that time frame. And I think that's why both the transition with our new CEO, John Yip, has been, I hope, very positive, because I really gave a lot of thought to what work needed to be done in the organization before I stepped down, and how both I was prepared for that, as well as the organization. And that was at least 2 to 3 years before I really was clear about the time frame. So I think that's another component that when people, especially CEOs, think about moving on, to really give that some thought, because it does have an impact on the organization in so many different ways. And I think that that's where a CEO can really provide true value to ensure it's well positioned for the future without them being there anymore.
Yeah, that would probably be a good follow-up conversation at some point about succession planning. I know it's something that is a burning issue for a lot of organizations and individuals, and how to attack that and treat that. And I think that your own example is something that many could probably learn from and perhaps emulate. But I am curious about your own leadership in this, Shirlee. I mean, what defines you as a leader? What do you think prepared you for this role that you ended up filling? And perhaps on the flip side, what did you have to change, I guess, to sort of last 30 years in this space?
Well, we could start with what prepared me, and I would just say life really prepared me in so many different ways, both as a professional, as a nurse, certainly also as an athlete, where I, did a lot of sports and activities when I was younger, quite younger, and also working in other industries well before I even moved into healthcare, where I was in more sort of hospitality and, very sort of people-focused environments that really taught me about the customer first, which is a little different than people-centered and client-focused, but it really did have a very different orientation to how I moved into healthcare. And I would say a little unusual, because I really did work from what individuals were looking for and what they felt their needs were, and how best I could respond to them in a very different way, where certainly historically as health professionals, we did not always look at care from that perspective. And it was a different starting point. I think too, what prepared me was observing and learning from leaders, both that I didn't admire as much as I could, as well as people that I looked at and really watched, observed, and then started to imitate and say, I really like the way they're engaging with people and getting people energized and inspired. So I'm going to follow them. And then I'm going to actually begin to imitate some of the things that they're doing. And that probably, believe it or not, was probably one of the most significant learning points, much more than theory in understanding it. And then over time, I think moving from, if we want to use sort of leadership terminology, which I always roll my eyes at and go, no, it's lived experience. But I would say it's a combination of strategic leadership, where I always am focused on tomorrow, the future, and trying to position the organization for where I believe the world is changing and how we can have an impact. In addition to now more than ever, transformational leadership, which is really about getting the energy and the cooperation of an organization. And especially when we looked at the social enterprise language, I thought, wow, this would be a really interesting opportunity to have everybody understanding the shared purpose that we're part of. And that's what's so incredible about healthcare. And we don't do a good job at that. and really look at either governments or organizations or structures and say, this is probably the most meaningful area of work that anyone could be involved in. So why don't we all embrace the purpose that we're involved in here? And I think that gets everyone to rise to a much higher occasion than their own professional directions and what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, some of what I've heard, and I forgive me if I try to sort of distill some of this into single words and things, but to correct me, but even going back to the introduction I read about your, I guess your lifelong learning and an approach to sort of continually adapting and learning in that approach. And I sense, I guess, some of what you're saying is almost a natural curiosity as well, whether that through observation or looking for other examples or things like that you can sort of emulate or follow, and but also curious about that tomorrow side of things too, and not just being static in that one space.
Absolutely, it's an excellent summary. And I would say the first 10 years moving into this role, I spent more time examining leaders in other sectors than healthcare, for a variety of different reasons. And then in particular, home care is much more about logistics and mobile workers, and a very different delivery model than our typical acute care system. I also felt that I could learn, and let me use the word energy, a different way to energize staff and position things differently. And so I spent time also in the high-tech world, and that was way back when high-tech was just beginning, and idea factories and all the cool things in sort of California, and trying to just get a different starting point to how we could look at healthcare in what I would call a interesting way, an entertaining way, but also really learning from other industries. And I think that was probably the smartest thing I could have done, even though at the time many sort of wondered, like, what is she doing, and why is she looking at these other kinds of industries and groups and innovation and new ways of doing things. And then over time brought that into how it makes sense for SC as a social enterprise. And that was kind of the beauty of the 30-year journey, that we started with this cool innovation, learning, a whole different approach, to then now bringing it into how it can be incredibly impactful. And it does take a long time. That's why I think leaders that don't stay in an organization over a period of time, it's very, very hard to lead directionally and to really understand everything that's happening. So on one hand, when I see people move around in five years and people say, well, what did they accomplish? I say to myself, well, what could they accomplish over that period of time? It's very challenging to have vision realized within a 5-year time frame.
Yeah, I think we see it in our governments and politicians as well, right? Leading through
Totally.
those terms, and it feels more that sort of quest for re-election as opposed to accomplishment.
So true.
So I guess in that transformational sort of description that you have about learning and changing and looking at things differently, how does that reflect, I guess, on leadership as a whole? And without getting into sort of books and definitions and like that, I agree with you fully on that. But I mean, are leaders different today than they were 30 years ago? Do we need different leaders today than we needed 30 years ago? Like, how would you define, I guess, the way we recruit leaders, develop leaders, and those that are fulfilling those roles today?
Well, I certainly think effective leaders are a component of space and time that they're involved in. So obviously, if you work from that premise, 30 years ago, what were the competencies and the strengths and even the values, I would say, are different than they are now, 30 years. From what is the potential, from also, in particular in healthcare, how how the populations have changed, how the actual, conditions, health conditions that people have changed, where there are unmet needs. All of those things are very, very different. So how a leader, and maybe we call them a new leader or a leader moving into this space, certainly in 2022 at this moment in time, I think is fundamentally different. Our talent is different and what their needs are. Our clients and families are different and what their needs are. And society at large is incredibly different. So based on that, for sure, I think there are some commonalities of leaders that probably are consistent over 30 years. I certainly know I'm not the same person I was 30 years ago, from many different facets of even having my ego in check. That's probably the most relevant one, that, after time you have more confidence, you have people trust you more, so you're able to do things very, very differently than at the start. But I think generally at this moment, the need for an open-minded leader is critical, because there are no answers. We are all seeking solutions based on the pace of change and opportunity. I think adaptability and innovation is another key factor for leaders that is different now. And I think ensuring that we really are listening to our talent and what they require to provide great care, and listening to our clients and families. They're much more engaged. They are much more aware and knowledgeable about the decisions they want to make for themselves. So therefore, how we lead in that environment is very, very different. And I think it'll continue to change. And that's why this sort of need for ongoing evaluation of what's happening, and also even more so self-awareness. I'm not sure 30 years ago that there was the same feeling of vulnerability, self-awareness, thinking things through from a leadership point of view. And I think that has happened because there's so much out there. If you're kind of with a facade and aren't really authentic, you'll be found out really, really quickly. So you have to be constantly examining, what am I about? Can I, function in this environment, and what works best? All those kinds of what I would call self-reflection things that I don't think they were as relevant 30 years ago. I think it was much more transactional activity, more so than now as we're trying to move into transformational.
Yeah, and I suspect a bit more traditionalist in their approaches, so that those transactions and sort of do because I say, or right, follow me because I'm the boss, or whatever that might be.
Exactly.
But yes, I think you've thrown out, I think, some important words there about the authenticity side of it. The humility, I think, is sort of part of that description. And
vulnerability, yeah. Because there, in the world we're in, as I begin to think of something right now, in 2 seconds, it's already happened. So it really is to realize the opportunity and the speed at which things are happening. And it's not about who knows the most. It's really about how to bring all of the people together to come up with the new ideas and the new solutions, which is a very different competency of leadership. Then you're absolutely right. Then let's call it the more traditional role of, this is what I think we should do, so let's all do it.
Yeah, or you have to be the owner of all the knowledge, and that's why people follow you, because you know everything, as opposed to, I think it's just describing that authentic, vulnerable side, right? And I think we've seen that probably a lot through the pandemic for those leaders that have survived and thrived in that space, as those that, didn't know all the information, because none of us did, but nevertheless were able to still, I think, help people through that, even though they they didn't know where they necessarily tomorrow was going to be, but they still had that, I guess, the trust or the relationships, I guess, with those people.
Oh, exactly. And I think too, leaders and their communication skills communication skills have always been important, but the clarity of articulating for people the context of what is happening so that the team can figure out the next steps and some of the solutions is, I think, different now than it has been in the past. So the ability to explain what's going on in the environment, to kind of back up to the rationale of something versus the execution, is even more relevant, and in particular for senior leadership roles. And that's a challenge, because we usually move into those roles because we were very good operators or executed well. So you very quickly want to get into, this is what we should do, versus this is the environment, here are some of the issues, and then really to enable the team to be determining a variety of different solutions and to be making some sense of that. And that is I think, even more so where I find with communication, and it's everything from certainly oral, written, how one behaves on social media, how one positions things, how we now do things in a virtual, how we have virtual town hall, and explain things in a whole different, where I would call it inspirational communication, but also intelligent context is a very different way of describing things than we typically have in the past.
So can I maybe ask you a question about your own vulnerability in this space, which is, did you ever, I think as many leaders move into those different roles that you've just described, have that imposter sort of complex that went with it?
I think probably early on, I probably was like, I'm not sure. I think I probably thought I knew more than I did. So I probably was pretending it within myself more than anything. But I think you begin to realize when you have a number of other leaders that you admire, you begin to understand if you really can, one, be honest and truthful with your staff. And we use the word vulnerability in sort of a weakness. I think vulnerability can actually be turned around in a very positive way, where people, that's again where you will get a whole group to rally around you and beside you as you're trying to move forward, especially in the unknown. I would say, I think probably one of my skills has been the truthfulness of, when I don't know something, to say, you know what, I can't make a decision right now, and I'm just going to wait because I need a little bit more information, versus being worried that everyone thought I needed to make that decision at that moment in time. I mean, there's always a joke with me that when I say to people, I have to take a shower and think about this, that they know, well, okay, there's either the timing's off or Shirley's not sure about it. And I think that it is very important, especially for CEOs, to if in doubt, pause, because sometimes those mistakes are big mistakes. I mean, that's the other thing. I've always been a promoter of lots of little mistakes along the way, but sort of watch for the big ones. And I learned over time, sometimes when I've been looking at a problem, I get this strange feeling of sort of something's not right, but I dismiss it because there'd be pressure or a timeliness of what I needed to do. Then I, over time, started to realize when I would either rush to make a decision and it wasn't the best decision, to the next time identify the feeling versus the substance of the conversation. And if the feeling was telling me, something doesn't seem right here, let me think about it, I need a little bit more information, to pause and be respectful of that that feeling that I have. But that took me some time
Mhm.
because, we all think we're, logical, linear thinking. Let me just solve this problem, especially as clinicians, sort of what's the problem? What's the diagnosis? This is what we're doing. We don't sort of have these gaps in our thinking to go, well, let me just sit and ponder on this for a moment. But I do think that helped in my own development as a leader to be real about what I was trying to do. And in addition, hopefully to make better decisions along the way.
Yeah, that's great insight, and I think will resonate with lots of people. So thank you for sharing that. You've talked a bit already about the word transformation, being transformational leaders, and we hear it a lot, in healthcare today, and certainly as we're grappling with a system which is under strain and arguably under collapse, and has been for a long time. And so I think there's been that search for transformation and transformational leaders, and even the LEADS framework references that in the S about systems transformation. And I know from our own teaching of that, it is one of the areas that people struggle with the most, that it's also hardest to teach because it's so maybe not metaphorical, right, or abstract maybe in terms of what it means and how to get there. But maybe through your own lens as being a person who has arguably been a transformational leader in the system and SE Health, what does it mean to you, and maybe what is your own insight in terms of what that means and how to achieve it?
Well, in its most simplistic form, it is about, and I always bring it back to a bit of a sports analogy of, getting the volleyball team to all work together to understand the big prize that everyone's working toward, respecting and really identifying the skills, the competencies, and everyone really goes back to this shared purpose of what we're trying to do. All of the skills that make that happen are really, in my mind, what transformational leadership is all about. I do think, and I've talked about this, the communication is so critical, and you have to watch, because we want to move to direction where it's like, would you turn that up, please? Versus instead to say, I think it might be good if people could hear more about what we're trying to talk about. You see, it's a very different starting point than telling somebody what to do. And as leaders, we are wired to go into the tell somebody what to do. Here's a problem, I figured it out, and this is how we solve it. With, I think, the kind of transformational leadership we're looking at, which the outcome is that your staff will actually exceed what they think their goals are. If you've really achieved it, like they will go above and beyond what they have even positioned to strive for. But it is, again, all in the presentation. I think the charisma. People sometimes underestimate. They kind of go, "What do you mean, a performer?" I go, "No, but there is a charisma that I think plays out when someone's very committed and passionate about what they're talking about. Then they're going to have the kind of energy and discussion that people will go, yeah, I think I want to be part of that, and I want to work towards that." I think also, and we talk a lot about empathy, especially now with, I think, our workforce. Leaders have to really live and believe in really this empathetic support that is needed for people, because life is stressful, work is stressful, society is stressful. And I think leaders need to understand that part of their role is to make sure they're providing all of the tools, resources, and emotional support that their staff need. Because at the end of the day, that's the product we're offering, is the human exchange of our staff with clients and families. Again, all of that fits into how we may define transformational leadership. When I have read about it, I can't help myself but go, yeah, I really like that. That's cool. I really like that kind of leadership. I'm not sure I'm doing it justice. There's probably 6 levels and competencies and everything. But I think at the end of the day, it really is about, it's funny, I'll share with you. I have these sort of 6 very simple things that people have always said to me. Okay, how have you lived and kind of guide yourself with leadership? And I think these speak to transformational leadership, but I'd say it's Shirley's words.
Okay.
One is, be clear about your values because they'll be tested.
Mm-hmm.
The moment of certainty never arrives. So make the best decisions you can with the information that you have. Keep your eye on the prize. Don't get caught down in the weeds. Innovation is a journey, not a destination. Take your work seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. And that's the ego piece.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, know your brand, especially with leaders. And that's where a lot of people go, really? I go, yeah, know your brand, who you are, what you are. That's the charisma that each and every one of us have. And it's very unique, and it's all about who we are, and build on it. And many leaders take for granted that these things will happen. But I would say over time, not sure I consciously said, I'm going to work on my brand today, but it evolved where I thought I can build on this to help the organization be successful versus my own personal brand, but more the brand that was aligned and positioned with the organization. So those are sort of Shirley's bizarre 6 components of transformational leadership that I'm not sure I'm gonna get a PhD thesis on that. But
well, CHA Learning will give you an honorary one if we could. So. but yeah, I mean, put it on a plaque.
I think they touch on all the theoretical constructs. Sure. In what I would say sort of my real world analysis of what have been the 6 things that have been helpful to me.
Yeah, but it's they're easier to memorize or memorable, and they're realistic and achievable. So I think it's better than a textbook in many respects. But I think some of what you were describing there, I thought just maybe to also reframe again in terms of. One is I liked your volleyball analogy because I used to play volleyball myself, and I always thought it was the best team sport that I'd ever experienced, because you can't hide a player on a volleyball court. You win or lose as a team. You have one bad player, you will lose, right? So you survive through your team dynamic. But I think what you're describing as well is that when you're asking a question or being aspirational in terms of your team is coming back to even the language we hear in governance around being generational or generative, right? Giving people the opportunity to identify, I guess, their own goal, but not to be specific. Because if you tell a person to do something, then they will do that. Right. And they're done. Right. But if you give them a larger sort of space to be generative in, then yes, I think that's exactly as you say, then they will overachieve and make miracles happen.
And honestly, in my time at SE Health, it's funny you use that word miracles, because there are times I have thought, oh my goodness, this is a miracle. And I usually dream really, really big and real crazy sometimes. And the success of what we've achieved at times exceeded those bizarre dreams. And I go, whoa, this is amazing. So in theory and in real life, it does work. And it does work where there is a lot of happiness, a lot of focus, and you get the results. And it still is a wonderful environment where all of that can happen. So it's interesting how sometimes we think we have to be so serious with how we proceed through things. I think it limits our imagination and what we can actually accomplish.
That's great. So changing subjects a little bit here from the leadership discussion that we've just had to something else I know that's deeply important to you and your legacy. So if I was to ask you, what does the word home mean to you? What would you say?
Everything, really, because it is about how we live our life and where we experience all of the celebrations, happiness, sadness, sometimes even death. So it really is, for me, everything. And in particular, when we look at healthcare, for 30 years, I've been driven to try to meet the needs of what people want, which is to be in their homes, whatever those homes are, in the comfort and with safety and with information, so that they can heal and recover, and even more so thrive where they want to be. But there have been times where I've been enormously frustrated that the policies don't enable that the funding is challenging. I don't know how many years ago somebody asked me about home care. I said, well, it's not well understood. It's not well funded. And I reflect 30 years later, I could be saying the same thing today. So on one hand, I'm always positive. So I go, well, there have been advances. And especially now with COVID, I think there was a real understanding that care can take place in a variety of different ways for people. So I am hopeful in really two ways. I do think the aging population will push different care and different models. And I think that resulting from COVID, we'll look at other innovative approaches to either virtual or new places and locations to access care.
Maybe it's a bit of a leading question, right? But how does that fit within our current paradigm of our healthcare system and the way we view it today? And how do we get people to think about it that much differently? I know I've heard you talk on the subject, so I have a sense of what you're going to say, but I'd like to still hear it, and maybe to reflect on what's getting in the way of that.
Yeah, I'll tell you, in 1992, I think I had just started at SC, and I think the government was doing some kind of home care reform. I remember Alan Rock was involved, and they asked me to give a talk on innovation in home care. And, I was this, cutesy little thing there in 1992 going, now is the time. Home care, this is where everybody's going to be focusing. There's all kinds of opportunity. This is going to happen. And I think it was very true. It was the time. I think, though, that in Canada, we are so preoccupied with a more traditional system of acute care and medically necessary care. And there's been so many conversations about Canada Health Act. And I think you're right, this paradigm, and we are in this paradigm freeze that has to be not necessarily destroyed and thrown, but thawed out a bit so that, there's a broader way to look at a whole different starting point for people to access care. It's extremely challenging. There have been so many reports. There have been, so many what I'd call, wise brains trying to look at this. To be very honest, I think at this moment in time, it will be the population that pushes it, maybe the talent, the workers in the healthcare system. I'm not sure it's going to come from within, because I actually think we're 30 years too late with some of the bold policy changes, in particular to deal with the aging population. So, when you're that far behind, some of what we need to do is a real quantum leap. I don't think that can be achieved from within healthcare or within governments. It might need to be achieved through a more movement in some way, shape, or form.
But exercised in a political way, I guess, like through the electorate sort of demanding it, or protests, or yeah.
A whole variety. I think we've been dealing with so many and very important discriminatory issues where ageism is, and probably over the last few years, in particular with COVID, where I just was very distressed with where I felt we were dealing with the older population in a whole variety of different ways. First, how they were accessing or not able to access healthcare in their home environments. Two, being prematurely placed into long-term care facilities where their own hopefulness and happiness was really compromised in that environment. So I do think we're certainly beginning to see quite, and I would say a very broad societal movement looking at ageism in the broadest of context. I think that will help influence in a more effective way how the healthcare system responds to it. And I think it probably makes sense versus the healthcare system trying to deal with the broader aging issues and overthinking it and, trying to deal with too many facets of housing and social services and then healthcare, et cetera. But maybe if the two converge, then we can find the right place and space to where our healthcare delivery needs to really reform and transform in a different way. But I think that can only happen with the broader societal changes too, that are everything from social security to housing to retirements to it's a whole broad phenomena. And as I say, I think sometimes in healthcare we're unfair because we go, the healthcare is not dealing with this. I would say as a society and as a country, I do not think we've really created an effective aging strategy for the population and how that's changing over time. But better late than never. As I say, I'm always hopeful, and I go, okay. But I've come to realize I think it can't. It can't come just from within the healthcare system, because I think the issues are too broad and diverse. And I do think that there absolutely is an ageism problem that's to the core of what some of the issues are, much more than just the kind of paradigm paralysis in our healthcare world. I think it's a lot more complicated than we sometimes look at it from the Canada Health Act and preoccupation with hospitals and physicians. That's certainly a big piece of it, but it's a big piece of it through the health system. This whole conversation is a much bigger piece from a societal point of view. So it all depends where your starting point is.
So when you talk about ageism, and maybe we can just sort of unpack that from a definition perspective, because I think that you're describing something more than just an interaction with a person who's of a certain age and saying, I'm not going to hire you because you're 50 years old or 55 years old. You're talking about something much bigger than that. So maybe, if you could maybe just give us a bit of sense of that.
Well, you're right, and it's much more complex. With our book, I guess you can never have a podcast. If somebody's written a book or organization written a book, but I mean, the good news is I'm not going to show the book up on this. But our
chapter one,
our Future of Aging, which was a book through a collection of many people, and also Idea Couture that also helped us write this. It really talks about 5 chapters in sort of the future of aging, and they have 5 personas of people that how they're living now and how things could change, and they could have a very different life of what I would call hopefulness and happiness. And you're absolutely right. There are so many components to ageism, as we know with many other isms that exist. I mean, in healthcare, you could look at this in a very myopic way, and that's where we'd say, well, older people at a certain age should all be going to long-term care, versus, as we know, all of the complexities and the erroneous assumptions within that philosophy. But I think it'll be important, in particular in healthcare, that we start to chip away at some of these and invest in what I'd call the front door of our healthcare system, which would be both primary health care would be a kind of a virtual access to information, and certainly where people live in their homes and in their communities. If we just even put a dent in more access to care outside of the hospital and emergency space, it could be very interesting to see how the trajectory of care needs for people would change without us in the healthcare system doing a whole lot of different things. Certainly structurally, it wouldn't be necessary because people would behave and their needs would change based on how we now have the system designed. But that's going to be my next chapter. I mean, as you can see, with SE, there was, hopefully some method to my madness of stepping down and moving on. And you can see through this discussion, this whole topic is something is my next sort of passion and interest. So I've got to find the right soapbox to make that work. As home care was wonderful within the SE world, now I think I'm taking on sort of a new mission of what I think is really critical. That's even broader than the healthcare space.
Yeah, but it is how we treat, our fellow human beings, regardless of their age, right? And making sure that we can all live with dignity through that whole period of our lives.
Exactly.
So I think it is very profound and an important conversation, and without maybe being too morbid or being too blamey, right? But if we hadn't institutionalized so many of our seniors, right, what would the outcomes of COVID have been?
Yeah, I mean, I feel very strongly thousands of older people died that did not need to die. There's just, and that's a pretty sobering remark. And we've had many people write about it and comment on it. And you have to say to yourself, this was happening with any other group. I'm not sure we just say, okay, great discussion, let's move on. There'd be a complete outcry. And so I'm hoping rather than an outcry, we have some good, reasonable policy changes and begin to even tinkering with some components of both our social system and health system and housing system could make very significant impact.
Yeah, well, and I'm not the right person to say these kinds of things by any means, right? But in my own, outside sort of reflections, I mean, it does seem that there's fundamentally problems with the concepts of institutionalization, however that might be expressed, right? Whether it's in the care of our seniors, whether it's in the care of those with mental health challenges or other kinds of approaches, or obviously the worst examples in our Canadian history around the residential school systems, right? So, but they lead to common outcomes, which we should probably all be very ashamed of. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
And the clock strikes.
My clock is. Did we time that well or what?
Time's up. So I think, what do you think, fundamentally, I mean, you've talked about, I guess, some of what needs to happen and where it can't happen alone, but maybe just to sort of bring it back to something that we can sort of maybe put on that plaque as well. What is the barrier then to having that system and service in Canada that most of us would expect? And what will enable that transformation, do you think, more specifically in terms of, how do we get to those policy changes? How do we get to the levels of investment or whatever else that needs to happen here? So, I mean, what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, I think we are certainly beginning to, everyone, it's now becoming sort of a common discussion of the sustainability of our system, of how we are caring for the elderly. So always, I think a starting point is when people begin to identify and speak to the problem. We may not have all of the activity moving to policy yet, but there's definitely an awakening and an awareness. There are also, and I'm just rolling my eyes here so people can't see that, but there are just endless reports that people have put together to look at some of the changes and things that need to happen. I think now we're really into actionable activity, and come to realize it's not like it's some simple switch and this is what's going to happen, but that there has to be consistent changes and positioning. I think fundamentally too, Canadians need to have confidence that they can access healthcare and have their needs met, certainly with hospitals and physicians, but in also a broader way. Other health professionals that can be incredibly helpful to meet their healthcare needs, and that they can access this in many different locations and environments. And I think if we can build that confidence by creating and designing some of the systems that can be changed and reinforcing policies, it is an incremental way of doing it, but I've come to realize the profound, bold shifts. It's very hard to have that happen in this space. And so I do think as leaders, we have to begin to help identify some of the good things that are happening, versus I do find sometimes we get into this groupthink of a lot of negativity and, there's, we're just all depressed to how we need to move forward. I do think that I'm certainly seeing some, not only glimmer of hope, but some real activity and direction with some policy changes, but most importantly, an awakening. And unfortunately, COVID, good, bad, it did force us all to be now more aware of what's really happening. And I think that's positive, because I do think now when people begin to look at these issues, people are going to speak to what happened before and say, we want to improve this and change it. I think too, the public is talking very clearly and loudly that they want to remain in their homes. And so I think that is going to become a louder voice and a stronger voice, that you're right, from the populace and from our governments. They're going to have to respond to that. And we're beginning to see that. We're seeing that, but at the federal level, not a lot. And, people go, well, really? But at least to be using the language that people want to stay in their homes. Let's come up with some, economic incentives. Let's have some tax breaks for that. We're hearing a lot in healthcare how home care is a need. So all the talk is there. Now it really is to get into some actionable activity and to come up with some innovative funding. And also to understand that these spaces are messy. They're not the typical acute care, have a disease, have an intervention, have a recovery, and good to go. There's the chronicity of it that needs a different and kind of creative and innovative approach to how we both fund the initiatives and how we create new programs for them. But that's where I'm hopeful. We have very clever people, and we have a lot of wonderful talent that will thrive coming up with new ideas. So a lot of this, what really leaders have to do is get out of the way. I remember once, I think it was Leslie Thompson said that at some event. She said, we have to get out of the way. And I think there's truth to that, yes, but I think we also have to enable and provide the environment and the resources to make it happen. So, overall, I'm actually very hopeful that we're moving forward. At the same time, there's part of me that goes, wow, we're many, many years behind, so got to giddy up. I think the good news is with technology and a real push, we can not necessarily catch up, but actually transform into something that maybe is, maybe there's some opportunity to be late to the game. As I say, I'm ever hopeful. Either that or delusional.
Yeah, well, I guess the second most gets the cheese, so maybe there is something in that. But I do. I guess the question I would have for you is: do you think there's a reasonable? I mean, I guess if we're standing at a fork in a road, right? We have a risk that we can follow the transformational journey that you're describing, which probably requires a redesign and a rethink and innovation, as you've described. And then there's that other fork, which perhaps is the more tempting one in some respects, which is to redo what we've already done once or several times, which is, so let's invest in more long-term care facilities that look like the ones we already have. Let's build more hospitals. Let's hire more doctors and more nurses, and that will solve the world's problems. Which one do you think we'll take? Do you think it's a reasonable probability that we'll take the first?
Well, I think from an economic point of view, the simplistic thinking of investing in more long-term care beds and acute, the irony is that if that's all we do, unfortunately, we actually will compromise our acute care system and probably compromise our long-term care, which we know some people absolutely do require. That's the irony of it all. And that I've always said, if we don't actually have people access healthcare very early on in their journey, if we want to look at this from an economic point of view, at the lowest cost per episode to where they need that service, we will crumble the system. There simply will not be enough, I don't think, resources if everyone goes into the high-end cost. And so many other countries have realized that and try to position things differently. The irony is the minute we leave the acute care system, we micromanage to death the lowest cost to the system, which is, I always find it very interesting, where I've always said, if it's a lower cost, maybe open the door even more so that we actually have people coming in sooner and maybe over-resourcing. What's so terrible about maybe an extra hour of care for someone in their home environment versus 30 days in an acute care bed when they don't require it? And that's where some of our thinking, where I do think the values are a little, and I do think that's because historically, where our starting point has been in our healthcare system, that is flawed. But that's where I do think you need good policy leaders and healthcare leaders that challenge how we're funding and designing, in particular, those other components of healthcare that are clearly can create greater value for everyone. So I am hopeful that eventually reason will prevail. If not, the economy may make it abundantly clear that we need to shift things differently. And I, certainly seeing people reach out to say, how are other countries managing this? How are they dealing with an aging population? Let's look at what they've put in place. I do think that other countries have certainly, not perfectly, but tried to resolve this. And I think Canada has a great opportunity now to begin to look outward to see, what they can learn from what the rest of the world has done.
Very, very insightful again, and gives us a lot to think about. And I do hope that we continue to look outward for those opportunities and challenge, I think, the decisions that we're going to make that will be the legacy, I guess, for generations to come, to hopefully we get it right. So maybe on that final note, on the subject of legacies, we can talk about, there's been a lot said about you, through the awards that, even HealthCareCAN's given you, the many other accolades and parties and events that you've participated in leading up to your retirement or this transition in your life. So maybe just as a whimsically, Shirlee, what do you think is that one legacy that you're leaving as you finish this transition that nobody has been talking about?
Well, I think, and it's an interesting question because there are kind of two ways that I looked at it. And it's that how delightful and how much love you can have working in healthcare. And that we typically kind of look at this, thank God I'm getting out of this and can now do something else. But, you know, I have truly loved what I have done, believe I've been privileged to be part of such an important part of society. And, you know, I think all of us working in this space should feel that, because I actually really do feel that it's been an amazing career. I have really reached, not just because of what I've accomplished as an individual or what SC Health has accomplished, but honestly, you know, from one patient to another where we've met their needs, or, you know, where I've had a call and someone has said, you know, it was wonderful, this experience for my family. The kind of love of the work for all of us, not just frontline or clinicians, for all of us working in this space. I think that is an important thing that as healthcare leaders, we don't hear people say that. Where other industries, when they've left, they've kind of gone, I loved my work, I love what I did. And, you know, it could be, you know, usually it's some kind of manufacturing thing. I'm going like, really? Where in healthcare, I think that it's something that the spirit should be there. So I think that's probably one. The other is, in particular, for the space I've been in the community and with people, is the thinking that we have to go broader with how we look at healthcare for people, and that it is life care. And it goes back to your question about the home, where the home is everything. The home is where you live. And so when we look at healthcare for people, it's healthcare in their life and where they're living it, which is in their home. And we don't normally look at home care from that point of view. We look at home care as sort of a subdivision of our healthcare, when it really is, in my mind, the starting point of how people are living their life and how we then should design the system for them in a very different way than how we've designed a system that they have to intersect with health, versus we are intersecting with how they're living their life. Very different way of looking at it. That's more of a system sort of legacy that I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think like that word for me is so meaningful in so many ways, right? Because it provides that guiding star, right? In terms of how we do our work, why we're doing our work, right? What's most important to the people that we work with or for, and I think it keeps us grounded, I think. But
yeah, for sure.
So, well, I'm sorry our time has come to an end. Surely I could talk to you for hours or days, I'm sure, but it's been a great privilege to be able to spend this time with you and have this conversation with you today. So thank you very much for spending this time with us and sharing your experiences and your wisdom with all of our listeners.
It's been absolutely my pleasure. And there's lots of work for people in the community and in home care, in every environment. So any leader who's interested in being in this space, you will walk away with great satisfaction. So that there's my marketing role as I move on to another, with no vested interest in this space. But it is, I give a call out to all leaders in healthcare. Take a look outside of the traditional areas, because you may find those roles to be enormously fulfilling. And that's from somebody who worked 10 years in an amazing acute care organization and loved it, but actually was even more fulfilled in this other environment that I was part of. So if I can convince anyone to look a little broader than the traditional areas, then I think I've accomplished something.
Well, I hope you get your wish, and I think it's a testament to who you are as a person, that you did find your calling and purpose in that particular part of our sector. So thank you for all that you've given to us and to our country, and yeah, I look forward to having another conversation with you at some point.
Oh yeah, stay tuned.
Okay,
Bye for
thanks,
now.
Shirlee.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to the HQ, and I'm Dale Sherback, your host. You can find this and other future episodes on the CHA Learning website, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. We'd love to hear what you think, so please follow us on our other social media channels. Thanks for joining us in this discussion today. Please join us next time.